Good afternoon and welcome to the special Free Press Town Hall on COVID in the classroom. My name is Paul Samyn. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this discussion on the school year that was, and in some cases wasn't for far too many students here in Manitoba. We're gathered in the newsroom, boardroom here at the Winnipeg Free Press, and you can see behind me the front pages from the past week, which are pretty much had a common theme since March of 2020, when COVID became part of our lives. And so they've been dominated by the pandemic and the school year that is ending, the school year that saw me watch my daughter graduate from grade 12 yesterday in a school parking lot, shed a tear. Well done, Gracie and her class of 2021. The school year ends on a note that I don't think anyone wanted. So we're going to try and discuss what happened, and we're going to look more importantly for lessons that can be learned and lessons that can be applied in the coming school year in September. I'm going to introduce our guest panelists today. I'm going to start with Rory Ramos. Rory is in grade 10 at the Met School at Maples. And I put a lot of pressure on Rory because she has to represent the roughly 200,000 students in the Manitoba public education system. So welcome, Rory. Joining us as well, we have Kathy Heppner. Kathy is the chair of the parent council at Earl Grey School. She also can wear a teacher's hat in addition to her parent hat. She teaches at a high school here in Winnipeg. Joining us from Bismarck, North Dakota, we have Kirsten Baesler. Kirsten is the State Secretary of Public Instruction. And anyone who is a frequent reader of my nightly COVID briefings know that from time to time, we have looked to North Dakota, both the good, the bad, and unfortunately in some cases the ugly, because they're our neighbors, and both their state and our province at various points have been COVID hotspots. So we want to get the experiences there. And finally, we have Maggie Macintosh. Maggie is our education beat reporter who has been working overtime through much of the pandemic because a key part of what COVID-19 has done in our province has obviously been the healthcare challenges, but those involving education. So Maggie is going to be bringing all sorts of perspective. Okay, so we're going to start with an open question that everyone is going to have a chance to answer. And that is, we want you to go back to September. We want you to think about what your hopes were, what your expectations were, and then try and see how closely reality lined up with what you had wanted to see. So we're going to start with Rory, because I think what's important is in this discussion is that we keep in mind what should be the focus of our public education system, and that obviously is our students, their experiences, their education, and their futures. So Rory, again, with all the added pressure of your 200,000 peers, tell me what you hope for, and tell me how close that reality matches as you reflect back on the school year that was.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I think that I was super excited to be back, and especially with the previous year of everything just being crazy and thrown out of the loop. I just wanted so badly for everything to go back to normal. While my experience with the first quarantine back in March of 2020 was fairly okay, I definitely think it could have been better. But we managed, and I just really wanted to have things go back to the way that they were. Being a Met student with a different kind of way of high school, I had so many projects and plans and internships that I wanted to pursue over the first few months of quarantine that just kind of stopped. And the world just kind of like stopped. And when it slowed down, and I just wanted to get back into September and hit the ground running into my grade 10 year. And I wanted to be able to really experience high school. Being that COVID happened in my grade 9 year, I never really had the chance to fully experience what high school is and what high school is supposed to be. And some of my friends have been bringing this up a lot lately. where we'd never actually got to have the proper high school experience. We entered grade 9, like freshman buzz, and right in the smack dab middle of the year, we get thrown into like this whole global pandemic, and suddenly, whoa, we have online learning, and oh, now we're being at home and we're staring at screens for hours on end on each day. And I just really wanted to have more opportunity to have those memories that adults tend to reminisce on most of the time, where they go back and go, oh yeah, in high school I did this and did that, and oh, don't you remember when you did this and you did that? And I haven't had the chance to have that yet. And so I was really looking forward to being able to dive into my learning more with everything being cut off, but also into the social aspect of what high school is supposed to be for, everybody else that had high school and wasn't in a pandemic.
Right. Okay. So that's Rory. That's a student view. Obviously, at the start of the school year, parents have hopes, parents have expectations. Kathy, tell us what you've seen and how you felt.
Yes, no, it was quite the start of the year. I would say as a parent, I was a bit apprehensive. Like I have children in early years, in middle years, and middle year school and high school. And so for me, I felt like I had, my fingers in 3 very different communities. I think for September, there was maybe a hope with my youngest daughter about having more normalcy that Rory was talking about, just wanting to kind of get back into how things were prior to COVID. However, recognizing that now we've got a new normal, right? Like instead of the back to school shopping for just like the backpack and the runners, now we're like, okay, now we need the masks. We need 2 for, each day. And now we need to figure out how we're going to keep them clean. We've got the paper bags. Like it was really heightened cautiousness for the safety aspect of it, but there was a desire like to have things normal. I know for myself, with my kids, my older kids were going into grade 11 and grade 12, and I really was hoping that, especially for my son who was in grade 12, he graduated yesterday as well, Paul.
Okay, congratulations.
So, thank you. Yeah, and I definitely shed a tear in that parking lot. My hopes were that there would be some sort of normalcy so that grade 12 year could there be some sort of sports? No. Could there be some sort of clubs or activities? No. Could there be connection with their peers? Well, no. Cohorts meant that he actually didn't attend classes with any of his friends. So school, then the expectation and kind of what ended up being was you went, you learned, you left. And then anything else that was attached to education, like the social emotional and all of that, felt like we weren't able to touch on that because the kids were in the building for such a short amount of time. That was for September. And I know as a parent council chair, we had our first meeting outdoors and socially distanced, and we were all very nervous because we didn't know how that would work. And a large part of our school community means that parents can get involved and be volunteering. And we basically had to say that that's not going to be a reality this year. However, we couldn't say year, we said like right now, because we were always looking just a few weeks ahead. Like maybe there'll be a change in 2 weeks, maybe there'll be a change in 4 or 6. And I think maybe what would have been healthier is instead of the hope and a wish a few weeks down the road to say, how do we make a plan for, our parent council and our school community for the year? How do we recognize that by October, it's a little too chilly to be sitting outside? What's our plan for our meetings and how are we going to get our parents connected? Because for myself, I felt so cut off from our school communities, couldn't be in the building, couldn't stop by to pick up anybody from after school. Couldn't just go in on a day off or an in-service day because of the safety concern, right? They didn't want to have so many people in, and because I'm a teacher, right? They didn't want my school germs coming into their schools. So I felt as a parent very cut off. And so I can't imagine that my kids going there every day, or for my high school kids every 3rd day or every 2nd day, how they felt that they weren't really having that connection. And so that was the reality for September, and then ended up being the reality for most of the school year.
Okay. Now, obviously, I'm going to go to Bismarck now with Kirsten. North Dakota was in the same boat that we were. COVID hit in March and classes were stopped. And that was pretty much the reality for both Manitoba and North Dakota as the 2020 school year came to a close. But your governor made a decision that schools would remain, there would be classroom learning. You're one of the first states to move in that direction. And by and large, you've managed to keep that classroom learning going. So talk about that reality and talk about how you managed to make it work.
Sure. So my hope for September as a public servant were to make sure that our families had their hopes met and our students have their hopes met to the best of our ability. So that's where I was at in September. So to back up just a bit, we were in the same situation, Manitoba and North Dakota. And on March 15th, the governor and I, March 13th, the governor and I held a press conference and said everything, first identified case in North Dakota, we're going to move forward. Here's the decision tree that you need to use if it's present in your community. By Monday morning, by Sunday evening, actually, there had been, some significant outbreaks in Minnesota, and we have many of our large communities are on our Minnesota border. And so that situation, the desire from our families and our school systems had changed in a matter of 48 hours. And so the governor and I met with our National Guard that weekend and said, okay, we're going to make some different decisions. We said students were going to stay home Monday and Tuesday, and teachers would come to school with their administrators, their school leaders to decide if we needed to stay in a distance mode, what was their plan. And they had 2 days to decide to come up with a plan. Wednesday, the governor made a decision that for the rest of the school year, that school buildings would be closed to in-person learning. But every school district in our state had until April 1st to submit a plan. And if they did not submit that plan for continuing out their entire school year as was planned on their school calendar with instruction, that the state aid would cease. And so his mandate was that school continued. Buildings were closed, but school continued through the rest of the 1920 school year. And so that's how we continued. There was distance learning, 100% distance learning for all 450 plus of our school buildings in the state of North Dakota, and they completed their year, their school year. But as soon as we finished that and approved all of the distance learning plans through our office, the governor and I began to communicate with our Department of Health and said, okay, we're going to try a soft reopening of our buildings for summer school. And so immediately, and our calendar is just so different than yours. So our school, our school year generally ends the end of May, and we start up with summer school about the first week of June. We run for June, July, and then we take a few weeks off in August and start up in early August. So that's kind of how our traditional school year ran. So we decided on a soft opening. And in June and July, our schools were open, buildings were open to those small cohorts of children. And in July, we provided guidance to our school districts and said, this is a local school board decision. Some of our schools have 100 students K through 12. Some of our schools have 13,000 students K through 12. And so we couldn't make a statewide decision, but school boards would be able to determine how and in which manner they opened their school building doors to in-room to classroom instruction. So as we started the school year, the majority of our students were in-person classroom instruction 5 days a week as a cohort, if you will. But you have to remember that in North Dakota, 129 of our school districts have fewer than 300 students K through 12. Pretty easy for those school boards to make the decision. Yes, we can maintain social distancing. Yes, we can do food service. Yes, we can run buses that can maintain those 6 feet social distancing. But our larger school districts started up in a manner of hybrid learning. So where they broke it up into cohorts. By October of 2020, over 75% of our students were going to school 5 days a week in person learning. And by the end of January of 2021, all 100% of our school buildings were open to parents to have the option of 5 days a week in person learning. Only about 10% of our students' families chose for them to stay in that distance learning mode. And so that's where we were. So what were my goals in addition to making sure that the hopes and dreams of our students and our families were met in North Dakota? That was keeping our students and our teachers safe. I knew that regardless of the mode of learning, the model of learning, whether it would be distance, hybrid, or in person, our world was in disruption. Every student, every family, every teacher was experiencing disruption. And anytime we experience chaos, our mental well-being is disrupted, learning can't be as effective. And so I needed to accomplish, my hope was to accomplish a couple of things. Finish the unfinished learning that didn't happen in the spring of 2020 because of the massive disruption. Complete that unfinished learning that didn't happen for that fourth grader who's now a fifth grader, for that seventh grader who's now an eighth grader. Continue to support them social emotionally, get their basic Maslow's needs met of safety, food, shelter, those things, and help them advance in their learning. How well did we do? I would say, irregardless of the fact that we were in-person learning, every one of our students experienced a disruption as well. We still have some significant unfinished learning. As I take a look at our state assessment scores, and I'm not sure what you call that in Manitoba, but you have that annual assessment. As I take a look at 2019 to our 2021, the United States paused our testing in the spring of 2020. So we're only comparing 2019 spring to 2021 spring. What I see is everybody experienced some unfinished learning and aren't performing as well as they were in the spring of 2020. What I do see is our students that came from well-supported homes, they experienced less significant unfinished learning. Our students that were are from homes where parents were maybe first responders, or they didn't have that extended family that was able to step in. Maybe they didn't have that literacy rich or numeracy rich environment at home on their off days. Those students living in poverty and our students with special needs and particularly our Native American students experienced a more significant drop in their proficiency and their abilities. So that's what I've seen.
Great, thank you. We bring Maggie Macintosh in. Maggie obviously was setting up the school year to come, starting in August of last year. And at the time, the then Education Minister, Kelvin Gertsen, was talking about a lot of transparency. Now, I know, that it's everyone's first pandemic and there's not exactly a lesson plan for how to manage it. But Maggie, can you talk a little bit about the issues of transparency that were promised and what actually has happened as we wind down the school year?
Yeah, there are a few expectations I definitely had as a reporter covering this beat heading into September after Labor Day. And the first one was definitely transparency and what we were going to be learning as members of the public. And I think that when the then education minister came out and he said, parents are going to have all the information they need, and they did follow suit with that promise initially. The very first case in a school, we found out the student's room number, we found out what grade, and it was pretty easy to find out who that student was. I was hovering around the neighborhood school, asking students questions, and I definitely understand that there was a ton of backlash afterwards. Parents were upset on both sides of the spectrum. People thought it was too much, and then others thought they wanted even more. And ultimately, the decision was made to completely pull back from much of that transparency. And what we've seen throughout the school year is that oftentimes parents are finding out about exposures via Twitter with the parents who are actively crowdsourcing for letters about exposures. Sometimes they're not uploaded on the COVID map the province created this year in early 2021, I believe it was. And we had a period between mid-December and January where there were no postings of cases, even though they were happening. So there was definitely a lot of discrepancy about what parents, families, students were learning about. And I think that caused and added to a ton of the anxiety around other things like learning loss and getting food on the table and just caregiving, juggling. So that definitely added to the stress this year.
Great. I wanted to, obviously, when you're dealing with a global pandemic, health and safety is critical. So let's just talk about how safe schools were. The slogan in Manitoba was restarting safe schools. Was that, I think, what they tagged it? So Rory, quickly, did you feel safe in school? And just talk about that experience. And I think you've got an older brother as well who's in high school. So how safe did you feel?
My experiences with how safe I felt definitely differ from my brother's experiences. So just as a little bit of background, I go to the Maples Met School, but I share a building with the Maples Collegiate High School. So
And this is a big high school, right?
Yes.
How many students are we dealing with, Roy? It's one of the larger ones in Manitoba.
I'm not sure, but it is one of the bigger ones in the city. So there's tons and tons of kids. But the Maples Met School itself only has about 150 to 200 kids. So we're very, very small. So as a Met student, I felt safe because we had such small numbers, and we were able to properly social distance in the ways that we could, and there weren't many bodies packed around, and we always had the ability to sanitize, and we didn't have lots of, because of our small numbers, we had fewer classrooms, so we didn't really need to move around as much as traditional high school students would in the bigger schools. Having said that, I do attend extracurricular classes at the traditional high school. So I attend choir class with the other school building, meaning that I need to travel from my area of the school through the hallways and into my choir class. And in those times, and in those periods when I had choir class as well as gym class, because I attend gym with a traditional high school, it felt very dense. Even with the cohorting system that was put in place, I feel like there were still too many bodies inside the school. And obviously it's really hard because you can't control, how do you direct that many students in these tiny little hallways during times where you're trying to get through classes and times where maybe you have to go to the washroom, and washrooms are also packed sometimes. And lunch hours, how do you direct that many students to properly coordinate social distancing in spaces and hallways that are so tiny to bring about an atmosphere that you would feel safe? So as in the times when I would stay in the Met School area, I did feel safe. But when I had to travel between my classes and my classes in the traditional high school, I felt a lot more anxious being around so many people, and obviously not knowing who those people were in contact with. And so the amount of exposure that we were put through having to travel between places was definitely a concern.
Okay. Kathy, parents, I think the default setting is that we always worry. Talk about the stress you had when you're worrying about what your children were facing, and to a degree what you may have been facing as a teacher as well, being in the classroom.
Yeah. Well, definitely with my kids, like I said, they're in 3 different buildings. And so we had, different experiences. I would say for the most part, going into September, I was quite anxious about the safety, but I really appreciated, especially at the elementary school level, and then being, of course, on the parent council, knowing the steps that they were going to be taking. And I appreciated how the principal just said, when we get our first COVID case, this is our plan. I appreciated the idea of being proactive and having a plan as opposed to being reactive and having a sense of panic or fear. So it felt very much that the students were talked to about the safety and why we would do that, and but also balancing that with the social emotional. And I just want to highlight that because that is an area where I think for as a parent, my kids really struggled with. But the school was doing their best be able to keep my elementary school children safe. In the high school, my kids, my older ones go to a very large high school as well. And when they cohorted them, the kids weren't really in the building very often. It was 2 days out of the school day cycle. And they were willing to make changes because they found at lunchtime, as the weather got colder, more students were staying at lunch. And the lunchtime was the most difficult to be able to, maintain proper social distancing and things like that. So the high school actually made a pivot for second semester. And I remember thinking, why are they doing this? So I called up the principal. Actually, I emailed her and then she called me back. And I really appreciated that she took time to do that because our administrators have been, stretched very thin. And she explained the rationale. And she says, we're trying to balance with keeping them safe and not having them in the building at lunchtime. By moving to more frequent half days means we get to actually see them more. So we are keeping them just as safe or even safer, but we're connecting and making sure they're social, emotional, and then their academic needs are also met. So I really appreciated that balance, and that sort of set me at ease. But the numbers, I mean, it was very difficult to track. Okay, so are there cases in my child's school, and will I get a phone call from public health, or will I get a phone call from the principal and say, you've been, there's been a case in your child's class? There's always a sense of like, what will be next? But I guess it was sort of like I entrusted my children to professionals and hoped that they would do the best they could, because as myself as a high school teacher, I actually switched schools partway through this whole pandemic. So I moved from a resource position in a high school to now a classroom position. And I would say that being a classroom teacher, yeah, it is a bit stressful trying to keep everyone, safe and yet the building that I'm in now, they have done a really good job of maintaining that social distance, maintaining, cleaning protocols and things like that. But I feel like the contact that I have with my administrator is basically about, let's do contact tracing, as opposed to how are the kids doing with education, because that's the thing that we're so focused on right now. So,
okay.
Yeah.
As part of the safe discussion, I'm going to go to the first one of the questions that was submitted to us. And so the question was, do you think teachers and staff should have been vaccinated right after healthcare professionals, and would it have made a difference? So that's the reader question. I'm going to go to Kirsten in Bismarck. What decisions did the state make in terms of where teachers were on the vaccination queue?
So thanks for asking that. So yeah, we placed our teachers not on our highest priority, not the very first round. Of course, it was our hospital personnel, our first responders, our law enforcement, and of course then our most vulnerable, those that were living in congregate settings, long-term care association or long-term care, what we call our nursing homes, those facilities. But we were in the second tier. We were right after those first responders, right after those healthcare providers. And so we were really able to start rolling out significant vaccination to our teachers by mid-February, early to mid-February. And really by the end of March, any teacher that had wanted to get a vaccination was able to receive a vaccination. And so that made a significant difference.
And what was the rationale for that? Because we're going to get to your Manitoba, teachers were never prioritized, period. So tell me, what was the thinking about going and taking that course of action?
Because there was a long conversation that began in August of 2020, actually July of 2020, when healthcare met educators, and we formed a healthy return to learning team. And on that team, it was a state level team, a recently retired school administrator of the largest school district in our state, Bismarck Public Schools, a former public health administrator for our local public health, and a medical doctor specializing in infectious disease. And I'll tell you, I sat down with, and then me, and our director of human services. And I'll tell you that it was loggerheads for the first 4 days. And it was a true partnership, because it's really not a partnership unless you're angry with each other a few times, right? It's trying to get somebody else to support your plan. That's not a partnership. To really come to the point of, I came to the table as, what do we need to do to make sure our students are in school face-to-face with their teachers? And what plan are we going to develop for this state to make sure that that happens? And the public health officials came to it, particularly infectious disease doctors, said, okay, what are the schools going to do to make sure that when this happens, that they get everybody home? And once we were able to have a conversation about, that's not best for kids in any shape, even in physical. And I appreciate the question that you gave to both the parent and to the student about, did you feel safe? Well, in North Dakota, I think we've done a really good job, and this is something we're still working on, and it's a recent phenomenon, that we don't separate physical health from mental health anymore. Too often, I think we, as we call ourselves Midwesterners, when we say health, we talk about physical health, but health is health, right? You can't, why do we just limit health and health safety to whether you have a fever or whether you have COVID, and we don't talk about our mental health. And what we were talking about is there were so many young children that were not safe because their parents happened to be a first responder. We lack childcare opportunities in North Dakota, childcare places. What was it safe for that 8-year-old to be home because it was legally safe and their parent was a firefighter and their mother was an EMS first responder? And what was the emotional damage that was being done by the isolation that both the student and the family member talked about here? So we approached it by saying we have to look at health in the totality of mental health, academic health, and physical health. So mental safety, physical safety, and our academic future of ours. So that's how we approached it. And that's why we prioritized our teachers.
Okay, so Kathy, put on your teaching hat for a second. If Manitoba had done what North Dakota had done and started making teachers eligible for the vaccine, would you have rolled up your sleeve, and what do you think your colleagues would have done?
Oh, definitely. We would have been the first ones in line. We have conversations about it all the time. In fact, some of us are still trying to get our second dose. And so we cheer when we have a little sticker. Yeah, definitely being prioritized would have said, our priority is to have schools open and also to make sure that teachers are safe, because if we are caring for first responders' children, then should we not then be prioritized, right? And I like what you said, Kirsten, about the whole totality of health. We talked about that, but I think that prioritizing teachers for vaccinations would have actually put, action to the words that we were saying. We say we prioritize the education, we want the kids in the school, but we're not going to protect the teachers to make sure that they have what they need to be able to deliver quality education. First semester, I spent, actually as a resource teacher, I spent a lot of time covering for colleagues that were not well. I don't know if they had COVID or not, because you couldn't ask, I guess, but some of them also, I don't think were well with the mental strain of trying to keep a classroom together, and they needed a break. And so I spent a lot of time covering for colleagues that I think if they would have had an opportunity to be vaccinated right off the hop, they would have been in a better place and better equipped to be able to meet the needs of the students.
Right.
Can I ask a question? Did you guys have testing available in your school systems? Like, where that was one thing, I mean, and we had a very deliberate strategy about early identification, immediate isolation of those positive cases, and then contact tracing. So we were able to get the tests. So because you feel more confident and comfortable if you know that teacher across the hall from you went through that same rapid test that morning at 8 o'clock and tested negative, that same thing that you did. And so you feel like you can do that. Did you have that rapid testing available in your school buildings to make each other feel comfortable?
I would say it was lagging. Eventually we got it. So I feel like I got a letter. So I switched schools in February, and I got a letter from my school division saying, you can take this for rapid testing. But I had to go for a COVID test at the end of October, and there was nothing rapid about it at all. I had to wait 48 hours, and I still, of course, I wasn't feeling very good. Thankfully, the test came back negative. But I'm sure that people were wondering, she's not in the building, and has she tested positive? And I had lunch with her. It was stressful. It was very stressful.
Okay. On the subject of vaccinations, ironically, I think this qualifies as irony. At one point, the plan was Manitoba teachers were going to go to North Dakota because you had excess vaccine. That plan, at least as of 12:34 on June 29th, has yet to happen. I suppose if it happens in July, teachers will have more time to go down. Maggie, that was a plan that the Premier raised during the May long weekend. Why do you think teachers weren't prioritized for vaccinations and as Kathy Heppner would have liked, and as North Dakota was doing with its teaching staff?
I think it was I don't know exactly why that decision was not made, because every single teacher I talked to was very much in favor of lining up and getting the jab as soon as possible. And I think that had they prioritized teachers, this would have not only frankly backed up all of their claims that schools are the last to close, schools are the most important thing. That's something that a lot of us had been hearing since day one. And the fact that they didn't back that up with prioritizing teachers, I think was really disheartening to a lot of educators who had been facing constant uncertainty. I don't know if it would have physically offered enough protection given all of those really important vulnerable communities had to be prioritized in a physical sense, but I think that just the ability to get vaccinated would have lifted so much mental health, so many mental health challenges, so much anxiety on teachers who, you know, many of them have taken time this year off, have taken leaves. We're sort of in crisis mode. I mean, that's why we ended up having to close schools in part, was because there were so many teachers who were calling in sick because they were close contacts who had to be home, that it got to a point we couldn't even staff our schools physically. So back to the North Dakota thing and the vaccinations. I don't know why we never prioritized teachers, and I think that it should be a regret of this province.
Okay, let's we talked about the safety. Let's get to the outcomes. We want our kids to do as best as possible in school. Obviously, this year and the previous one presented a number of challenges. Rory, you talked about the experiences of high school that you'd hope to have, and you recognize they haven't had. So those are the experiences. Those are the things that happen with teams and clubs and choirs and plays and all field trips, all the fun things that I remember and that I want my kids to have, I wanted you to have. Talk about the education outcomes. Do you think you missed out? Do you feel at this point, finishing grade 10, that academically you are where you wanted to be, or are you not quite there?
I feel like I am not quite there.
Okay.
I wish that there were a lot of things that we had planned as a classroom and as an advisory class that we wanted to do. We wanted to learn about specific topics that we wanted to dive into. We had projects that we wanted to really take our curiosity and run with it. But that project, specifically this last closure that we had of schools being taken down, we weren't able to follow through with that. And I personally, and some of my friends and I have talked about it, and I'm probably my other classmates, we felt really disheartened by the way that we weren't able to pursue something that we were actually excited to do. You know, like as a student, yes, you want to prioritize your learning, but then you even want to more so prioritize it when your learning is something that you actually want to partake in. And that was taken away from us. Okay. And so the mental wellness of that kind of like hit us down a bit. And then we also weren't able to really feel prepared, and like there's a lot of unknowns going into how we're going to start the next school year. Will we be just diving into our grade 11 content, or will we be actually finishing our grade 10 content? What happens if we dive into our grade 11 content and we have no idea how that ended with our grade 10 content at the end of the year? How do we transition into there, knowing that there's not really a lot of things are like super unknown still? We're not really getting a lot of information, and obviously I guess we're just waiting for like a lot of the vaccine information to come out and like our statistics there before we can plan ahead to how we're going to follow through with next year. But I really feel like we missed out on a lot of things, both emotionally, socially, and academically.
Right, and you know, it's interesting, Rory, what you're just saying here. This dovetails very nicely, or segues, I should say, into the next question. Is anyone thinking about how to address the learning that students have missed out on? My child passed his courses, but only received 1/3 of the normal teaching. Is he going to be expected to perform as though he got regular teaching for his previous grade? Kathy, two hats, parent, teacher, you know what it's been like working at the dining room table with your kids. trying to do that remote thing, but you also know what the outcomes from curriculum are supposed to be. So can you talk a little about that and what you think might be happening as we return to school in September?
Yeah. Well, Kirsten talked a bit about, the students who definitely were able to perform better, the ones that had supports at home. And I know when schools closed last March, I was teaching from home and my kids were all at home. And I mean, I have an education degree, so I can sit down at the table at the end of the day and work with my kids, and being familiar with the curriculum, look at my kids and like, oh, okay, this is the curriculum we're doing and I've taught this before and let's go. So I feel for my own children I was able to supplement that. I often thought daily actually about the parents who would not have the capacity to be able to do that, or had other things going on, caring for parents or other family members, concerned about health, really having a job that is out in the public, first responders and the stress of that. So as a parent, I for my own kids, I felt like they did okay, but only because I was able to sort of fill the gap. And I know that their teachers sending curriculum home that was never meant to be administered remotely, for them to have to make those changes, and then to have material that was available for students and accessible at all different levels, expecting that they would not even have a parent at home to help them, was huge. And so I felt like where there was deficits, I was able to fill in the gaps. Not all parents were able to do that at all. As a teacher, some of the planning that we did, and especially as I entered into this classroom in February, we took a look at all the curricular outcomes for the particular courses. And as a department, we decided, okay, so what are the ones that they need for going into grade 10, grade 11, grade 12? What are the ones that are essential? Some of them, it would be really awesome if we could do, but these are the ones that if they can't meet this outcome, they are going to have ramifications, negative ramifications throughout the rest of their high school career. And so we planned that as a department. I think that was obviously very proactive. But then there were times though, of course, I finished up a unit. I think I'm doing a test on Tuesday. Oh, no, actually, school's going remote now. So now you're going to pivot. Now we're in school every day, but it's remotely. And so now I have to change what I was going to do for this entire unit. And that was hard. That uncertainty was really hard. And I keep second guessing, wondering, did I cover what I needed to cover? Also, the other thing is that I knew full well that this curriculum is fairly static. I mean, we do update our curriculums, obviously, we change and flex. But if these are the outcomes, I had to recognize I was not teaching regular grade 10 students. I was teaching grade 10 students who are dealing with the stress of being in a pandemic. And even if I did my very best as a classroom teacher, learning doesn't happen in the same way when some of those basic needs of safety are not being met or can't be met because we have students who are so concerned and families concerned about COVID. So this question about, will they have the equipment? It's a hard one to say. I feel like there has to be, as we move through high school, all of the grades, being gracious at what we would expect our students to be able to do, because really we're all in the same boat. Every single student on this planet has experienced a deficit in their education. I guess it's just what are we going to do next year? Pretend like nothing happened and move on? Or are we going to be responsive and recognize the gaps that we need to fill?
Okay, now obviously North Dakota recognizes there are gaps. Kirsten, you mentioned that, and obviously you've got some $500 million set aside to try and address those by way of summer schooling programs, targeted tutoring. Have you assessed that you talked a little about the gap? So you recognize that things were less than perfect, and you're going to try and play catch up and improve that. Just talk about that a little bit and how you're trying to move forward, because as you've heard here, obviously the pandemic has taken its toll on what's happening in the classroom.
A couple of things. You mentioned the $500 million that North Dakota has received to help us recover. I think a couple of key things. I mean, wow to Rory, super articulate student who is in embracing her own learning journey, which is amazing. She said something pretty profound that I would like not any adult to miss. She wants to know, like, okay, I finished 10th grade. Am I just going to go right into 11th grade? Or am I going to need to do some of the 10th grade? What are adults in my life going to expect of me? And I'm paraphrasing what I heard her say. And what are they going to do to help me? That is something that we can't miss. Our students want to know, okay, what's going to happen next year? And they deserve to know what is going to happen to them. Are they going to, if they've missed some things, is the high school that they're going to be like Kathy's, where we've taken a look and identified essential understandings and said, these are the things. And if Rory is in Kathy's school and says, okay, this was the essential understanding that you needed in mathematics this year or science this year, and you didn't get there, Rory needs to know whether you're going to help her get there in 11th grade, or if that ship has sailed and that was just 10th grade stuff and she needs to figure out a way to do that on her own with some other resources. So those are the things that we are focusing on as well. We call them essential standards as well, and identifying, developing each learning journey for each individual students. And so with this $500 million, what we are saying to our local school districts who have control over how they spend it is, don't spend it all at once. It's a 5-year spend. They have 5 years to do it. So for this summer and next school year, identify strategies that you know have already helped those students. Don't try and reinvent something. Don't try and create something super new. Don't exhaust your teachers even more by putting them through an exercise of a whole bunch of different professional development or learning this program or that program. Expand what you know works. High impact tutoring works. If you have 4 teacher assistants in a classroom, get 8 because you know that works. That's what we're telling them. Then in the middle of the spend the next 20 to 30% creating programs that you've always wanted to do because you heard about it working in Manitoba or you heard about it working in South Dakota. Create those programs to help those students that have always been struggling and see if it works. And then the last portion of the spend, as we draw near 2025, when it all has to be spent, use your data to recognize what worked and continue to fund those, and those ideas that didn't work, then just do away with them. Things that work, high quality teachers, investing in your teachers, to be giving them enough time to do personalized learning journeys, to specifically seek out what did Rory miss in 10th grade that she needs in 11th grade? What does Jenny need? What does Thomas need? What does, hire enough teachers to make sure that they get that individualized. Don't expect them to just repeat the same thing in 10th grade. Hone in on the skills, not just the seat time, but mastery of the standards and skills, the knowledge and the skills that they need. Don't make them just repeat 10th grade, but hire enough adults to communicate with families and teachers so their journey can be personalized during this recovery.
Okay. Maggie, we've heard that there were gaps, acknowledgement of it, and in the case of North Dakota, a response to it. You had a chance to interview the education minister, Cliff Cullen, last week as he sort of reflected on the school year that was. Is there recognition in Manitoba that there have been gaps and shortcomings? And is there any sense that they've got a plan in place to respond to that?
I think that our response has been disconnected in a sense because we have a lot of school boards, and so the province has given school boards the ability to adapt and make changes based on what their local communities need. And perhaps ironically, those school boards may soon be abolished with the pandemic as a reason, as the complicated pandemic response is one of the reasons that is being cited for that change amid all the recovery. And anyway, so the minister talked a little bit about some of the challenges, but I think he acknowledged that there has been some good. We've seen teachers going outside a lot. Oftentimes, some phys ed teachers, music teachers have spent much of their winters teaching outdoors because of space crunches. And so I don't think there isn't a detailed plan on how we're going to address recovery learning in Manitoba. And as we can see from what Rory and Kathy both said, there is a lot of uncertainty still and ongoing anxiety about that. And I do think also it's important to note that when we talk about learning loss, recovery learning, I know a lot of teachers take offense to those terms because they seem to imply that teachers have not been working 130%, 150, 200% to get as much curriculum out. But I think it's important to note that students, teachers, we've all learned a lot this year when it comes to emotional intelligence. But there is just no doubt about it that we haven't been able to squeeze in every single element of the curriculum that we could have in years past. And going into engagement and how we're going to bridge some of those gaps in future years, I think it's important to start thinking too about the fact that we can't only focus on STEM, literacy, numeracy, because a lot of those students who are disengaged, they come to school because they love their extracurriculars. They come to school because they love participating in music and arts and all those programs that are so important. And the one last thing I will say is that I was talking to a director of education in Cross Lake, and in many of the First Nations in Manitoba that don't have ideal internet connectivity, they've wiped out a lot of the school year using paper packages. Hasn't been as ideal as it has been if you have a full computer setup. And so I know in Cross Lake, they're planning to do a condensed year with if you're in grade 4, for instance, you will do all of your grade 4 for the first half of the year, and then grade 5 will be condensed into the second half. And so it's worth thinking about what that's going to look like in Winnipeg when many students did have the ability to connect frequently. So yeah.
Okay. This was a question submitted by a parent. I'm going to leave it more as a comment, but just because I do think it should be on the table, just so everyone's aware of everything that has happened. And it was a question: is anyone thinking about the coming school year and how to address students who feel completely disconnected and disengaged from education? Our son's teacher commented to us that he would not recognize his students if he met them on the street. My child feels like an anonymous stranger, not a student that teachers recognize or care about. I mention that only because obviously there's the gaps, there's the costs and everything else that is associated with the pandemic. I'm mindful of time, so we're going to turn to our student and our parent. If you had a chance to sit down with our education minister and ask him one question or give him one bit of advice, Rory, what would that be?
That is a very tough question. I'd say, just out of my personal experience and talking with my classmates, coming from me, I feel like we really need to take a look at the emotional and mental wellness of the student. If the student does not feel inspired or motivated to attend school, then they will not. If the student is not excited to learn the content, or at least the content is not presented in a way that is engaging for the student will not engage. So no matter how much money you throw at any system, if your environment is not a positive one, you will never get anywhere.
Okay, Kathy, your question, to the minister.
Yeah, I would echo what Rory said about the emotional state of the students and also the engagement piece, because now that you've stripped everything away from school, it's really quite stark. And where that connection is going to be. I wouldn't need a whole lot of money being thrown at the system, but it would be good to have some, because I know for if the system works where you can have more adults in the building, then that does increase the chance of having students being connected to somebody, to anyone that would really be able to support them socially, emotionally, academically. But I would just like to know what the plan is, and plan for recovery learning, plan for meeting these deficits for students in all areas, right? Like, how are we going to address the social, emotional, and academic and the mental well-being of the students? And then also, like, who's going to help you put together this plan? Who's at the table that you would listen to voices to make a plan for what's best for our students? Will you have parents? Will you include students? Will you have teachers around the table to make a plan? And can we be proactive as opposed to being reactive after the fact? Because we don't have time for that. Really, there are lives at stake, and I'm not just even thinking of, like, I'm not thinking just about a COVID pandemic, but we have lives at stake with students that who are disengaged from school. That really, this is their last hope. right? If they're not engaged in school, then we risk losing them, and they're way too valuable to lose.
Okay. Kirsten, I'm just, if you could in 30 seconds, what key lesson from North Dakota's experience would you say, having listened to our discussion today, that would you recommend that Manitoba consider as we prepare for the next school year?
As the educational leaders in Manitoba, I would encourage them to, if they haven't already, created a cabinet or, a kitchen cabinet type of membership that is comprised of family members, of students. Listen to your customers, listen to the people that you serve. You're created to educate those people, and your partners in that are the educators. So listen. I would also say, to end on a positive note, there's not a lot of good things that we can say about the pandemic, but I think there are a few. Rory talked about going back to normal. I'm not excited about going back to normal because we were stuck in a pretty traditional way of teaching and learning. And I think our students may have lost some things, but they have gained a greater voice. They have gained more learner agency. They've taken more control and they've been provided opportunities to empower themselves. I hope that doesn't go back to just the sit and get type of education that we were delivering in North Dakota. We have realized the need to personalize every student's learning journey. The learning and mastery of content should be the constant, not just the amount of time that they sit in their seat. Those things have changed because of the pandemic. I don't want to go back to time being the constant and you finished 2 semesters of 7th grade, so therefore you move on. I want to make sure that they've mastered the learning, and if it takes them a semester and a half or it takes them another 2 semesters and 2 weeks, let's make sure learning is the constant. So that's I want to be positive about what we've learned and be better because of it on the other side.
Great. All right. I'm going to thank our panelists because our hour is almost done. I want to thank Rory Ramos from the Maples School, the respective of a grade 10 student who I'm sure is going to do remarkable things in grade 11. I need to thank Kathy Heppner. She wore the hat of both the parent chair and a teacher, Kirsten Baesler, bringing that perspective from our neighbors to the south of us in North Dakota. And finally, Maggie Macintosh, our education beat reporter, whose COVID assignments and COVID homework will continue all summer. That's right, Maggie, there's no rest for you. I need to thank our readers. Your support funds our newsroom's journalism and makes events like this possible. We will be sharing this on YouTube for anyone who missed it, and we'll be blasting out those links later. And finally, I think we really do need to say thank you to everyone in the education system, the administrators, the teachers, the support staff, everyone who dealt with the COVID curveballs that were coming high and inside all too frequently, and for all that you've done. And for the students, you did not have the year that we wanted, but we hope that what you learned is going to help you go forward. It's about to be summer here in Manitoba. It is summer in North Dakota. So to everyone, be healthy, be safe, and be smart. And thank you very much from the Winnipeg Free Press.